Spirits demand revenge, 7 mysterious deaths explained. In a small village cursed by a forgotten ancient burial, 7 people mysteriously die from electrocution while working in the fields. A seasoned exorcist named David, with a deep understanding of spiritual forces and feng shui, is called to investigate the series of bizarre deaths that have left the villagers terrified. As David delves deeper into the village's dark history, he uncovers an ancient curse linked to a tomb that was accidentally disturbed years ago. What begins as a standard exorcism quickly spirals into a battle against malevolent spirits, with David encountering strange deaths, ghostly apparitions, and powerful supernatural forces determined to protect the cursed tomb. Amid storms, terrifying hauntings, and the rising death toll, David faces a moral dilemma. Can he lift the curse, save the village, and confront the wrath of the ancient spirits guarding the cursed land? With only his wits and spiritual tools, David must navigate a path through the supernatural, encountering dangerous entities and disturbing truths that challenge both his skills and his beliefs. The clock is ticking, and the village's fate hangs in the balance as David risks everything to unearth the buried truth. Will he break the cycle of death, or will the ancient curse consume him as it has so many before? Part 1. The Mysterious Deaths. In the heart of the mist-laden countryside, there was a small, forgotten village. Isolated and untouched by time, it was a place where life moved slowly and change was rarely welcomed. But something was different now. Something ancient, hidden beneath the earth, had stirred, and with its awakening came death. Death in ways that the villagers had never imagined. It began with Mr. Kent, a quiet man known for his stoic nature and calm demeanor. No one in the village could have predicted that he would be the one to start it all. The night it happened, the air was unusually still, the kind of stillness that sends shivers down your spine without warning. The fog hung low over the fields, swallowing the village in a thick, suffocating silence. At first it was the strange laughter that woke his neighbors. High-pitched and hysterical, it echoed through the narrow streets like the laugh of a man who had lost his mind. No one dared to approach the small wooden house at the edge of the village, where the sound grew louder, more erratic, more unhinged. But soon it wasn't just laughter. There was a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone pounding against the wall. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning, they found Mr. Kent. He had smashed his head repeatedly against the stone wall of his home, until there was nothing left but a pool of blood and a silent, twisted smile still etched on his face. It was a death that made no sense, a scene straight out of a nightmare. The villagers whispered of curses and madness, but no one could understand what had driven a man like Mr. Kent to such madness. The shock of his death lingered in the air like a dark cloud hanging over the village. People spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the subject when they could, as if mentioning it would bring the same fate upon them. But what happened next was worse, much worse. Barely a week had passed before another death struck the village. This time it was Mrs. Jane, a middle-aged woman known for her friendly nature and infectious laughter. She had been out collecting water from the well when it happened. One moment she was chatting with a neighbor, her voice cheerful as ever, and the next she collapsed, her face contorted in terror, as if she had seen something so horrifying that her heart simply gave out. The village was now on edge, gripped by fear. The idea of 2 deaths so close together and so strange in nature was impossible to ignore. Whispers spread like wildfire. Rumors of an ancient curse, of spirits long forgotten, of something buried beneath the earth. And in the center of it all, the villagers began to recall something they had once considered a mere myth, the ancient tomb. The tomb was not far from the village, nestled at the edge of the forest, overgrown with moss and vines, hidden by centuries of neglect. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a relic from a time when the village itself was nothing but a fledgling settlement. Few had ventured near it, and those who did rarely spoke of what they had seen. But recently, construction on a nearby road had disturbed the tomb. Workers had uncovered parts of the burial site that had been hidden for centuries, and though the project was quickly abandoned, the damage had already been done. In the days following the disturbance, strange occurrences began to plague the village. Livestock went missing, crops withered inexplicably, and at night, eerie lights could be seen flickering near the tomb. Some villagers claimed to hear strange, whispering voices in the wind, voices that seemed to call out to them, beckoning them toward the forest. Then, the deaths became more frequent. A young man named Robert was the next to fall victim. He had been working late in the fields when, according to his co-workers, he suddenly stopped, his eyes wide with fear. He began muttering incoherently about shadows moving in the distance, shapes that no one else could see. Before anyone could react, Robert bolted, running into the nearby woods, his screams echoing long after he disappeared from view. They found his body the next morning, curled at the base of a large oak tree, his mouth open in a silent scream, his face frozen in terror. By now, panic had taken hold of the village. People locked their doors at night, refusing to venture out after dark. Children were kept indoors, their parents fearful of the malevolent force that seemed to be lurking just out of sight. The air grew thick with superstition, and the once tight-knit community began to unravel as suspicion and paranoia spread like poison. Friends turned against friends, accusing one another of bringing the curse upon the village, of angering the spirits. A small group of villagers, desperate for answers, ventured to the tomb one stormy afternoon, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for the horrors that had befallen them. What they found only deepened the mystery. The tomb had been further disturbed, the entrance slightly ajar, as if something had clawed its way out from within. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something foul, something unnatural. As they ventured deeper, they saw it, the cracked sarcophagus, its lid partially shattered, and the bones inside scattered as though something had riffled through them. But the most unsettling discovery was not the state of the tomb, it was the markings on the walls. Strange symbols carved into the stone with a precision that no villager could explain. They were unlike anything the villagers had seen, ancient runes that seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. The group quickly fled the tomb, their hearts pounding in their chests. The village elders, who had been skeptical of the curse, now had no choice but to acknowledge that something had been awakened, something that was not meant to be disturbed. The deaths continued, each more horrifying than the last. One man, a farmer, was found dangling from the rafters of his barn, his body twisted in ways that defied the laws of nature. His wife swore she had heard him speaking to someone the night before, but when she went to check, there was no one there, just a cold, empty barn. Another victim, a young girl, was found floating face down in the village's pond, her skin cold and lifeless, though the water was shallow and calm. Her parents insisted she knew how to swim, but they could not explain why she had wandered out to the pond in the middle of the night. The village was drowning in fear, and with each passing day, the body count grew. The pattern was undeniable. Now each death was somehow connected to the tomb. Those who had dared to go near it, those whose homes bordered the forest, all seemed to be marked by whatever force had been unleashed. Then came the final, most terrifying death, the village priest, Father Elias. Known for his strength of faith and unwavering courage, Father Elias had been the villagers' last hope. He had dismissed the talk of curses and spirits, insisting that there was a rational explanation for everything. But deep down, even he felt the creeping dread that something far beyond human understanding was at work. One night, after leading a desperate prayer service for the village, Father Elias made the fateful decision to confront the tomb himself. Armed with nothing but his crucifix and a Bible, he ventured into the forest under the cover of darkness. Hours passed, and when he did not return, the villagers feared the worst. At dawn, they found him at the entrance to the tomb. His body was crumpled at the base of a tree, his eyes wide open, his hands clutching the crucifix so tightly that his knuckles were white. But it was his face that chilled the villagers to their core. It was twisted into a grotesque expression of pure terror, as though in his final moments, Father Elias had seen something so horrifying that even his faith could not protect him. With Father Elias gone, the village had lost all hope. The curse had claimed its most steadfast protector, and now there was no one left to save them. The tomb, the spirits, the deaths, it was all too much for the villagers to bear. Some packed up and fled, abandoning their homes and the land they had known their entire lives. Others, too paralyzed by fear, simply waited for the curse to claim them too. As the fog rolled in once more, thick and unrelenting, the village fell into a deathly silence. The tomb stood at the edge of the forest, its entrance dark and foreboding, like a gaping maw waiting to devour its next victim. The village, once full of life, was now a place of death, where whispers of the curse echoed through empty streets, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. And somewhere deep within the tomb, something waited. Something ancient, something angry. It had been disturbed, and it would not rest until every last soul in the village had paid the price. Part 2. David's arrival. The sun was sinking behind the misty hills, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape as David made his way toward the cursed village. His car rumbled down the narrow dirt road, the engine's growl barely audible over the howling wind. The air was thick with a palpable unease, the kind that seemed to cling to his skin, heavy and suffocating. In all his years as an exorcist, David had faced many horror spirits, demons, curses, but something about this village felt different, darker, more malevolent. The call had come just days earlier from a man named Lenny, who had stumbled across David's name while searching for someone, anyone, who might have the knowledge to break whatever curse had gripped the village. His voice had been frantic, desperate. 7 are dead already, Lenny had said, his voice trembling. People are terrified. We need your help. Please come. David was no stranger to desperation. He had seen it in the faces of those who had lost loved ones to unnatural forces, in the trembling hands of men who had stared into the abyss and realized they were powerless. But Lenny's voice had carried something more. It wasn't just fear, it was hopelessness. As David approached the village's outskirts, his fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The forest that bordered the road was dense, the trees gnarled and ancient, their branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching out to drag him into their depths. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area, their absence creating an eerie silence broken only by the wind's mournful wail. The first glimpse of the village came through the fog, small, isolated, and shrouded in an unnatural gloom. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but no one was outside. It was as if the entire village had turned inward, too afraid to face the world beyond their doors. As he drove down the narrow main street, David caught glimpses of faces peering from behind curtains, eyes wide with fear, but no one dared to step out and greet him. The curse hung over the village like a thick, impenetrable fog, its weight pressing down on everything. Even David, seasoned as he was, could feel it, the oppressive, suffocating presence of something dark, something ancient. He parked his car in the center of the village, where the only sound was the wind rustling through the desolate streets. Lenny appeared as if from nowhere, his face pale and gaunt, eyes sunken with sleepless nights. David, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would draw the attention of whatever lurked in the shadows. David nodded, extending his hand, but Lenny didn't take it. His hand stayed in his pockets, trembling. "It's worse than we thought," Lenny continued, his voice shaking. Much worse. David studied him, seeing the signs of a man on the edge. Fear clung to Lenny like a second skin, and his every movement was hesitant, as if he expected something to reach out and grab him at any moment. "Tell me everything," David said, his voice calm, steady. He had learned long ago that the only way to face the darkness was to confront it head-on. Lenny nodded, glancing nervously at the houses around them. "It started months ago, when they disturbed the tomb," he said, his voice barely audible. "They were building a new road through the forest, and they found something. An old burial site, or maybe more. No one knows for sure, but the moment they dug it up, strange things started happening." David followed Lenny as he led him through the village, their footsteps echoing ominously in the empty streets. "First it was small things," Lenny continued. "Cows going missing, dogs refusing to go near the forest, but then people started seeing things. Shadows, faces in the windows at night, and then the death started." Lenny's voice caught in his throat as they passed the house of the first victim. The windows were boarded up now, and the air around it seemed colder, heavier. "Mr. Kent was the first," Lenny said, his voice hollow. "He went mad, started laughing hysterically in the middle of the night. By the time anyone got to him, he'd bashed his head against the wall until there was nothing left." David's jaw clenched. He had read about the deaths before he arrived, but hearing it from someone who had seen it firsthand was different. "How many now?" David asked. 7, Lenny whispered. 7 people, all dead in ways that he trailed off, his eyes darkening with memories too terrible to recount. "And the tomb?" David asked, his voice low. Lenny nodded toward the distant edge of the forest. "It's there," he said. "But no one goes near it anymore. We tried sealing it off after the first deaths, but it didn't help. Whatever was disturbed, whatever was let out, it's angry. And it's not going to stop." David's gaze followed Lenny's toward the forest. Even from a distance, he could feel the malevolent energy radiating from the trees, a dark, pulsing force that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Whatever had been uncovered in that tomb, it was ancient and it was powerful. As they walked, David noticed the fear etched into every corner of the village. People moved silently, avoiding eye contact, their faces drawn and pale. It was as if the village itself had become a reflection of the curse-haunted, hollow, and slowly dying. Lenny led David to the small cottage where he would be staying. It was old, its wooden walls creaking in the wind, but it had been prepared for him. Candles lined the windowsills, and a thick layer of salt had been poured across the threshold, a futile attempt to ward off whatever evil lingered in the village. "Thank you," David said, nodding to Lenny. But the man didn't leave. He lingered at the door, his hands trembling at his sides. Lenny began, but his voice faltered. "Can you stop it? Can you save us?" David met his eyes, seeing the desperation there, the hope clinging to the edge of despair. He had seen this look before, in towns ravaged by spirits, in families torn apart by forces they couldn't understand. It was the look of someone who knew they were already dead, but needed to believe there was a chance, however slim, of survival. "I'll do everything I can," David said, his voice steady, but without false promises. He had learned long ago that sometimes there were no happy endings. Lenny nodded, a glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes before he turned and disappeared into the fog that now seemed to cling to the village like a second skin. David closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. The air inside the cottage was thick with incense, but it did little to mask the underlying stench of decay that seemed to seep from the very walls. He set down his bag and began unpacking his tools, candles, charms, talismans, and a small worn book of incantations. He had come prepared, but as he spread his tools across the table, he couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't be enough. He lit a candle, watching the flame flicker and dance in the dim light. The shadows on the wall seemed to shift and twist in ways that didn't align with the flickering light, and David's gut tightened. There was something wrong here, something deeply unnatural. He approached the window, peering out into the fog-covered village. It was silent now, but he knew the villagers were watching from behind their curtains, waiting for him to do something, waiting for him to save them. But David wasn't here just to perform a ritual or say a prayer. He was here to confront whatever was haunting this place, to face it head-on and banish it. And he knew from experience that whatever it was wouldn't go quietly. Night fell quickly, the fog growing thicker, swirling in ominous patterns around the village. David could feel the eyes on him, the unseen, the unknown watching, waiting. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small compass. It was an old tool passed down through generations of exorcists, and it had never failed him. But as he held it in his hand, the needle spun wildly, unable to find true north. David frowned, turning in a slow circle, watching as the needle continued its chaotic dance. Whatever was here, it was everywhere. It surrounded the village, suffocating it. David's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the forest. The tomb. He knew that was where he needed to go. Whatever had been disturbed, whatever was angry, it was there, in the heart of the forest, waiting for him. With his bag of tools slung over his shoulder, David stepped out into the night. The fog closed in around him as he made his way toward the tomb, the village disappearing behind him. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, their branches twisted like grotesque fingers reaching for him. As he entered the forest, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence deepened. David could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the malevolent energy swirling around him like a predator stalking its prey. But he pressed on, his heart steady, his mind focused. He would find the source of the curse. He would confront whatever dark force had been awakened, and he would end it. But deep down, in the pit of his stomach, David couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the darkness might win. Part 3. The Cursed Tomb. The night air was thick with dread as David stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the abyss of ancient trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. The villagers had warned him not to go any further, that beyond this point lay something far worse than mere superstition. But David had long since stopped fearing what lay in the shadows. He had faced the unknown before, and while he had scars both physical and mental to prove it, he had always emerged the victor. This time, however, there was something different. He could feel it like a cold hand gripping his spine. Something primal, something angry, had been disturbed, and now it was ready to take its revenge. The village elder had been reluctant to tell him the full story at first. His face, creased with age and exhaustion, had darkened when David asked about the tomb. The man's hands trembled as he spoke, and his voice was laced with guilt and fear. It wasn't supposed to be disturbed, he had said, his voice a low whisper, as if speaking of the tomb might bring its wrath. We didn't know what we were digging up. The ground was soft, perfect for building the new road. No one knew that there was something beneath it. David's heart sank as he listened to the story unfold, each word painting a picture of a calamity that had spiraled out of control. The villagers had been desperate to modernize, to connect their isolated home with the nearest town, and so construction had begun. It had all seemed so innocent at first. But then the digging crew had hit something, a stone slab, buried deep beneath layers of earth and centuries of time. Curiosity had gotten the better of them, and they had pried it open, revealing what lay beneath a tomb, ancient and untouched, with carvings that none of them could read, but all instinctively feared. They didn't understand, the elder had continued, shaking his head. They thought it was a discovery, something valuable. But as soon as they opened it, strange things started happening. The air around the tomb became heavy, almost suffocating. People working on the site felt like they were being watched. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been shadows. And cold spots appeared even in the middle of the summer sun. We should have stopped them. But we didn't. David had seen this pattern before, a disruption of ancient, sacred ground, and a retaliation by forces far beyond human comprehension. The spirits of the dead were not to be trifled with. He had been called to villages like this many times before, but he had never felt the kind of raw, unbridled malice that now seemed to hang over the village like a death sentence. As the elder had described the events that followed, David felt a knot tighten in his chest. The deaths had begun soon after the tomb was unearthed at. The first to die had been one of the construction workers, a young man barely out of his teens. He had fallen ill within days of the tomb's discovery, plagued by violent nightmares in which dark, twisted figures clawed at him from the shadows. His screams had echoed through the village on his final night, as if he were being torn apart from the inside out. When they found him, his face was contorted in terror, his body rigid as though frozen in his final moments of agony. The deaths had continued, each more bizarre and gruesome than the last. Those who had been directly involved in disturbing the tomb were the first to go, but soon the curse spread to others in the village. It was as if the spirits were growing stronger with each life they claimed, feeding off the fear and despair that now blanketed the village. We tried to reseal the tomb, the elder had admitted, his eyes downcast. We thought that if we put everything back, it might stop. But it didn't. It's like something was unleashed when we opened that tomb, something that can't be put back. David could see the fear in the elder's eyes, the desperation of a man who had already lost so much. You said there were carvings on the tomb, David had asked, his voice low but firm. The elder nodded and described them, strange symbols, unlike anything the villagers had ever seen before. Some thought they might be ancient protection spells, others believed they were warnings. Either way, they had failed to protect the village from what had been unleashed. David now stood before the forest, knowing that the source of the curse lay within. His hand tightened around the talisman in his pocket, a small piece of jade inscribed with protection runes that had saved his life more times than he could count. He would need every ounce of his power tonight. The trees loomed tall and imposing as David stepped into the forest, each step bringing him closer to the tomb. The deeper he ventured, the colder the air became, as if the warmth of life had been siphoned away, leaving only the chill of death. The wind howled through the branches, whispering in voices that seemed to come from another world, each gust carrying with it a sense of dread that sank deep into David's bones. The tomb wasn't far now. The forest floor became more uneven, littered with roots and stones that seemed to rise out of nowhere, tripping him up as if the earth itself was warning him to turn back. But David pressed on, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He could feel the malevolence growing stronger with every step, an almost physical presence that pushed back against him. Then, through the trees, he saw it, the tomb. It was half buried in the ground, its stone surface slick with moss and age. The entrance was jagged, as though the earth had tried to swallow it whole but failed. The carvings the elder had described were still visible, though worn and faded. They seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light, like serpents etched into the stone. David's skin prickled as he approached. He could feel them. The spirits, they were here watching him, waiting. Their presence was undeniable now, a cold, suffocating force that pressed down on him from all sides. David's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been trained for this, prepared for encounters with forces beyond the veil of death. But the intensity of the spirit's anger was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Kneeling before the tomb, David examined the carvings more closely. His fingers traced the ancient symbols, feeling the energy pulsing through them. They weren't just warnings, they were a seal, meant to keep something in, but the seal had been broken, and whatever had been imprisoned here was now free. David closed his eyes, whispering a prayer under his breath. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial of holy water, pouring it slowly over the entrance of the tomb. The liquid sizzled and evaporated on contact with the stone, as if the very air around the tomb was rejecting it. The spirits were restless, their anger palpable. He could hear them now whispering in a language long forgotten, their voices like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled through the trees, stronger and colder than before. It slammed into David with the force of a freight train, knocking him backward. The air around the tomb grew thick with swirling mist, and within the fog, dark shapes began to emerge, twisted, contorted figures that seemed to shift and flicker like smoke. Their faces were hollow, their eyes nothing more than empty sockets, yet David could feel their gaze burning into him. They were the spirits of those buried here, their rest disturbed by the villagers' reckless actions. But there was something more. David could sense it, a presence far older, far more powerful than the spirits themselves. Something that had been trapped here long before the villagers had even existed. The mist thickened and the spirits closed in around him. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent. David's hand shot to the talisman in his pocket, gripping it tightly as he began to recite the incantation that had been passed down through generations of exorcists. His voice cut through the whispers, steady and strong, each word a command that resonated in the air. The spirits recoiled, their forms wavering in the mist, but they did not retreat. Instead, their whispers turned to screams, high-pitched, blood-curdling wails that sent shivers down David's spine. They swirled around him, faster and faster, their shapes blurring together into a cyclone of darkness. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to maintain his composure. He could feel the malevolent force growing stronger, feeding off the fear and chaos in the air. His talisman glowed faintly in his hand, but the spirits were relentless, their anger all-consuming. And then, from deep within the tomb, David felt it, a pulse of energy so dark, so overwhelming, that it nearly brought him to his knees. It was the source of the curse, the thing that had been imprisoned here for centuries. And he was awake. The ground beneath David's feet trembled, and a crack appeared in the stone surface of the tomb. A low, rumbling growl echoed from within, the sound of something ancient and monstrous stirring in its prison. The spirits, once frenzied, fell silent, their hollow eyes turning toward the tomb in reverence. They weren't the ones in control here. They were merely servants, bound to the will of something far more dangerous. David's heart raced as he stared at the crack in the tomb, the darkness within seeming to pulse and writhe like a living thing. Whatever had been sealed here, it was breaking free, and if it did, there would be no stopping it. With renewed urgency, David began the final part of the ritual, his voice rising above the oppressive silence. The ground shook violently, and the air around him crackled with energy. But even as he chanted the ancient words, he knew that time was running out. The crack in the tomb widened, and a clawed hand, black as night, reached out from the darkness within. The spirits began to chant, their voices joining in a twisted, otherworldly chorus as they welcomed their master back into the world of the living. David's eyes locked on the hand as it gripped the edge of the tomb, pulling itself free. Whatever was inside it was ancient, and he was angry. But David was not ready to give up. He drew a deep breath and gripped his talisman, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. If he was going to stop this thing, it had to be now. With one final, desperate incantation, David plunged the talisman into the crack, his voice ringing out in the darkness. Part 4. The Investigation. The night was eerie still as David stood at the edge of the forest, clutching his worn leather bag filled with spiritual tools. His fingers brushed over the cold brass of the compass, its needle twitching wildly even as he stood motionless. The trees, tall and gnarled, loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting in grotesque shapes against the moonlit sky. The village behind him was a distant memory, swallowed by the creeping darkness of the woods. Only the faintest glimmer of light from a faraway lantern could be seen, flickering in and out like a fading heartbeat. Tonight, David was alone. The tomb lay somewhere ahead, hidden deep in the forest heart, a place shrouded in death and silence. David's breath fogged the air as he exhaled, the temperature dropping with every step he took. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but his feet kept moving, driven by an unseen force. It was as if the forest itself was pulling him toward the source of the curse, dragging him deeper into the abyss. The compass in his hand spun furiously, the needle never settling on one direction. David's grip tightened, knowing this was a sign there was powerful, uncontrollable energy ahead. The kind of energy that could rip apart the veil between life and death, that could summon things best left forgotten. The kind of energy that destroyed those who underestimated it. As he moved deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, brushing against his skin as though warning him to leave. The air grew thicker, almost choking, and a strange, oppressive silence settled over the forest. Not even the wind stirred. It was as if nature itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. David stopped at a small clearing, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the outline of the tomb ahead. It was a low, moss-covered structure, ancient and forgotten, half buried in the earth, as though the forest had tried to reclaim it. The entrance was barely visible, a jagged opening that looked like a wound in the ground. Thick, knotted vines snaked across the stone surface, as if nature itself was trying to keep whatever was inside from escaping. The compass needle spun faster now, the thin metal vibrating in David's hand. His pulse quickened. Whatever lay ahead was beyond mere superstition, it was real, and it was dangerous. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, like walking into a dense fog. A faint, unnatural light seemed to shimmer around the tomb, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing like fingers of darkness. David's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as his hand hovered over the bag slung across his shoulder. Suddenly the mist began to rise from the tomb's entrance. At first it was thin, barely noticeable, but within moments it thickened, swirling like smoke, forming strange shapes in the air. The mist twisted and coiled around the tomb, and David's grip tightened with unease. This was no ordinary fog, it moved with purpose, alive with malevolent energy. David took another step forward, his fingers brushing the surface of the tomb. The stone was cold, far colder than it should have been. His breath hitched as the mist condensed into a solid form in front of him, taking the shape of a figure tall, looming, and radiating an intense, hostile energy. The temperature dropped sharply, and David could see his breath, white and wispy, in the freezing air. The spirit that appeared was unlike anything David had ever encountered. Its face was pale, stretched and gaunt, with hollow black eyes that seemed to peer into his soul. Its mouth was a dark void, and from within came a voice that sent a chill down his spine, a whisper that was both ancient and filled with rage. "Leave it," hissed, the word hanging in the air like a curse. "You do not belong here," David's heart pounded as he reached into his bag, pulling out a small charm engraved with protective runes. His hand trembled slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had faced spirits before, some far more terrifying than this, but something about this one felt different. This was no lost soul seeking peace, it was something darker, something that wanted to destroy anyone who came near. The spirit's eyes narrowed, its form flickering as though it were caught between two worlds. The mist swirled around it like a shroud, twisting and writhing, as if alive. David's grip on the charm tightened and he spoke, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I am here to put an end to this. Your rest was disturbed, but I can help you find peace again." The spirit's laughter echoed through the clearing, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "Peace," it rasped, its voice like dead leaves rustling in the wind. "There is no peace, only vengeance." Before David could react, the mist surged forward, crashing into him like a wave. It enveloped him, cold and suffocating, the spirit's form flickering in and out of existence as it moved with impossible speed. David stumbled backward, his head spinning as the air around him grew heavy with malevolent energy. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, like an invisible hand squeezing his throat. Desperately, David raised the charm, whispering an incantation under his breath. The runes on the charm glowed faintly, casting a dim light that pushed back against the darkness. For a moment the mist recoiled, and the spirit hissed in anger, its form warping and distorting as it fought against the light. But it wasn't enough. The spirit was too strong, its hatred too deep. The compass in David's pocket began to spin wildly again, the needle vibrating uncontrollably as the air crackled with energy. The ground beneath him trembled, and David's stomach lurched with the realization that whatever had been released from the tomb was growing stronger with each passing moment. The spirit lunged at him, its hollow eyes burning with fury. David barely had time to react as the mist surged toward him again, wrapping around his body like icy tendrils. He gasped for breath, his vision blurring as the pressure increased, squeezing the life out of him. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the spirit's laughter rang in his ears, mocking him, daring him to try and fight. But David was no stranger to death. He had seen it, fought it, and sometimes even cheated it. His hand shot to the small vial of holy water tucked inside his bag. With a quick flick of his wrist, he shattered the vial against the stone of the tomb, sending droplets of the blessed liquid splattering across the spirit's form. The reaction was immediate. The spirit shrieked, a sound so piercing it made David's ears ring. The mist writhed violently, twisting and contorting as the holy water burned through it. For a brief moment, the spirit's form flickered, becoming translucent as it recoiled in pain. David took the opportunity to pull out a second charm, this one inscribed with an ancient symbol of binding. His fingers flew across the charm's surface as he muttered the words of power, his voice growing stronger with each syllable. The air around him shimmered with energy, the charm glowing brighter as the spell took hold. The spirit shrieked again, its form twisting violently as it was pulled toward the tomb. David's incantation grew louder, more forceful, as he channeled every ounce of power he had into the binding spell. The spirit fought back, its eyes burning with hatred as it clawed at the air, trying to break free. But the charm held, and the mist began to dissipate, swirling back into the tomb like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. The ground beneath David's feet rumbled as the tomb sealed itself once more, the crack in the stone surface closing with a final, resounding thud. The air grew still again, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the clearing lifted, leaving behind only the faintest trace of the malevolent energy that had nearly claimed his life. David stumbled backward, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His hands shook, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but he had done it. The spirit had been bound, its power contained once more within the tomb. But as he stood there staring at the now sealed entrance, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The spirit had been powerful, far more powerful than any he had encountered before, and its words still echoed in his mind. There is no peace, only vengeance. David knew enough about the supernatural to understand that spirits like this didn't just disappear. They lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And if this tomb had been disturbed once, there was no guarantee it wouldn't happen again. He looked down at the compass in his hand, the needle now still. The investigation was far from over. The curse was still in place, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the next fool to awaken it. David's eyes narrowed as he slipped the compass back into his pocket. He had stopped the spirit for now, but there were more answers to be found, more pieces to this dark puzzle that had claimed the lives of so many. And David was going to find them, no matter what it cost. Part 5. The battle begins. The night sky was a canvas of inky blackness, punctuated only by a pale sliver of moon hanging low over the treetops. The oppressive weight of the forest pressed in from all sides, and the faint whisper of wind through the branches was the only sound that broke the silence. David stood at the entrance to the tomb, his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts, each exhalation a cloud of mist in the cold night air. His fingers tightened around the jade amulet hanging from his neck, a small, ancient relic inscribed with protective symbols, blessed by an old master. It had never failed him, but tonight David felt its weight more heavily than ever before. The air around him was thick with a malevolent energy, vibrating with tension. He could feel the darkness closing in, an invisible force that crept closer with every passing second, suffocating the light and hope from the world around him. The spirits were near. He could sense their anger, their unrelenting hunger for revenge. They had been disturbed, dragged from their eternal rest, and now they sought only one thing: destruction. And David stood in their way. A chill ran down his spine as the first flicker of movement caught his eye. The mist, thick and unnatural, began to swirl around him, curling like tendrils of smoke. Shadows stretched and twisted in the periphery of his vision, fleeting figures darting in and out of the gloom. They were watching him, waiting, their presence palpable even if they remained just out of sight. David's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands remained steady. This was the moment he had trained for, the culmination of every battle he had fought against the forces of darkness. He reached into his bag and pulled out a handful of protective charms, small, intricately carved tokens of silver and bone, each one blessed with ancient rites to ward off evil. As he scattered them in a circle around him, the ground shimmered faintly, a thin barrier of light forming a protective ring. The mist thickened, and from its depths, the first spirit appeared. It moved with an eerie grace, its form barely solid, an ethereal figure with elongated limbs and hollow, black eyes that burned with a hatred older than time itself. Its face was a twisted mask of fury, its mouth a dark, gaping void from which no sound emerged, yet David could feel the scream in his bones. The spirit floated toward him, its movements disjointed, unnatural, as if it were being pulled by strings from some unseen puppet master. David raised the jade amulet, his voice steady as he chanted a protective incantation. The words, passed down through generations of exorcists, carried power, each syllable a shield against the encroaching darkness. The spirit hissed, recoiling as the amulet's glow grew brighter, its light casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. But as the first spirit retreated, more began to emerge from the mist, dozens, then hundreds, their forms shifting and flickering like phantoms. Some were tall and skeletal, others grotesque and hunched, their twisted faces frozen in eternal agony. They circled David, their whispers growing louder, a cacophony of voices that grated against his ears, each one filled with venom and malice. "You will join us, one spirit?" rasped, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot stop us. This place is ours." David's grip tightened on the amulet as he took a step back, his eyes darting from one spirit to the next. They were surrounding him, closing in from all sides. His breath quickened, but his resolve remained firm. He had faced dark forces before, but never on this scale. This was different. The spirits weren't just lost souls, they were warriors, bound to their tomb by a curse, now unleashed to exact their vengeance. With a quick motion, David pulled another charm from his bag, holding it aloft as he chanted. The air around him shimmered again, but the spirits were relentless, their forms flickering as they surged forward. The light from his charms dimmed under the weight of their combined fury, and the protective barrier around him began to crack. A cold gust of wind howled through the clearing, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. David could feel the ground beneath him trembling as the spirit's energy intensified, their power feeding off the very earth itself. The darkness around him grew thicker, more oppressive, pressing down on him like a physical weight. His lungs burned with the effort of each breath as the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Then, without warning, the spirits attacked. They came from all directions at once, a swarm of blackened shapes, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. David barely had time to react as the first spirit lunged at him, its elongated claws slashing through the air. He twisted to the side, raising the jade amulet, just in time to deflect the blow. The spirit hissed as the blessed relic made contact, its form flickering as it was forced back. But before David could catch his breath, another spirit struck from behind, its icy fingers grazing the back of his neck. A shock of cold shot through his body, and he staggered forward, his vision blurring for a moment as the darkness closed in. He spun around, raising a charm to ward off the next attack, but the spirits were everywhere now, their forms swirling and shifting like a nightmare come to life. They struck again and again, their claws and teeth ripping at the edges of his protective barrier, tearing through the light with savage fury. David fought back with everything he had, swinging the amulet in wide arcs. As he chanted prayers of protection, his voice hoarse from the effort. But it was like fighting a storm. Each time he pushed one spirit back, another would take its place, their attacks growing more frenzied, more desperate. The ground beneath him cracked and splintered as the spirit's rage reached a fever pitch. Dark tendrils of energy snaked up from the earth, wrapping around David's legs, pulling him down. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, draining his strength with every passing second. His body screamed in protest, muscles burning as he struggled to stay on his feet. But the spirits were relentless, their attacks unceasing. David could hear their whispers in his ears, a chorus of voices that promised death, that taunted him with visions of his own demise. His heart pounded in his chest, fear gnawing at the edges of his mind as the darkness threatened to overwhelm him. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in David's mind. The spirits were too many, too powerful. Was this how it ended? Here in this forgotten tomb, surrounded by the angry dead? No, he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible above the din of the spirit's attack. Not like this. With a final burst of strength, David raised the jade amulet high above his head, the glow from the relic intensifying as he poured the last of his energy into it. The spirits recoiled, their forms flickering violently as the light seared through the darkness. The mist swirled around him, twisting and contorting as the spirit's screams echoed through the clearing. David's chant grew louder, more forceful, each word a command that resonated in the air. The jade amulet pulsed with energy, the light from its surface growing brighter, pushing back against the darkness. The spirits shrieked, their forms twisting and writhing as they were forced back, their grip on the earth weakening. The ground beneath David's feet trembled violently, and with a final, desperate shout, he brought the amulet crashing down onto the ground. A shockwave of light exploded from the relic, rippling outward in a blinding flash that consumed everything in its path. The spirits screamed in agony, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke as the light tore through them. The mist evaporated, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on David lifted, leaving behind only the faintest trace of the malevolent energy that had nearly claimed his life. David collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. His hands trembled, the jade amulet still glowing faintly in his grip. The clearing was silent now, the spirits gone, their presence nothing more than a memory etched into the night. But as David knelt there, exhausted and battered, he knew this battle was far from over. The spirits had been driven back, but the curse that bound them to this place still lingered, its power undiminished. He would have to go deeper to confront the source of the curse itself, but for now, David allowed himself a moment of respite. The battle had been brutal, and the toll on his body was immense. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew the worst was yet to come. The darkness that lay at the heart of this tomb was still waiting for him, and it would not be so easily defeated. David stood slowly, his muscles protesting with every movement. The air around him was still thick with the residue of the battle, a faint buzzing in the back of his skull that reminded him of the malevolent force still lurking in the shadows. He had won this round, but the true fight was yet to begin. The battle had only just begun. Part 6. The Rising Guardian. The silence around the tomb was deafening. The trees stood still, their branches no longer swaying in the wind. Even the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting. David's skin prickled as he felt the shift in the air, a foreboding sense that something far worse was about to emerge from the depths of the ancient burial ground. He clutched the jade amulet hanging around his neck, feeling its warmth against his chest, but even its protective power seemed dwarfed by the raw, oppressive energy radiating from the tomb. Suddenly, the earth trembled beneath him. David staggered back, his eyes fixed on the tomb as the ground in front of it began to crack, a jagged fissure splitting the earth with a low, guttural rumble. The air grew colder, and a faint, eerie glow seeped through the cracks, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. It was as though the very soul of the land was being torn apart, and something far older, far more dangerous, was being summoned to the surface. A skeletal hand, glowing with an unnatural light, clawed its way out of the tomb. David's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure rise from the ground, its body draped in tattered robes that fluttered as if caught in an unseen wind. The figure's form was that of a skeleton, its bones blackened and charred, as though scorched by ancient fires. Yet it glowed with an ethereal light, a soft, ghostly aura that bathed the clearing in a sickly green hue. The light flickered and pulsed, illuminating the creature's hollow eye sockets, where twin orbs of cold fire burned like dying stars. The guardian had awakened, its hollow, skeletal face turned toward David, and for a brief moment everything stopped. The wind ceased, the tremor stilled, and the oppressive energy that had been building in the air seemed to hold itself back, as though waiting for the creature to speak. The voice came not from the creature's mouth but from everywhere at once, resonating through the earth, through the air, and through David's very bones. It was deep and ancient, filled with both sorrow and fury, a voice that carried the weight of millennia. "You have disturbed the sacred." David stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced spirits and dark entities before, but this was different. This was something far older, bound to the land by an oath made long before human civilization had taken root. And it was angry. The skeletal figure stepped forward, its feet never touching the ground, hovering inches above the earth as it moved toward David. Each movement was graceful, deliberate, as if it commanded not just the space around it, but time itself. The glow from its bones pulsed with each step, growing brighter, more menacing. "You come here, intruder," the guardian's voice growled, "to where you do not belong, meddling in affairs beyond your understanding. For this disturbance, there must be a price." David's fingers instinctively tightened around the jade amulet, feeling its warmth as he drew strength from it. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto the guardian's flaming gaze. "I didn't come here to disturb anything," he said, his voice steady, though fear gnawed at the edges of his mind. "I came to stop the suffering. The village is under attack by spirits unleashed when the tomb was disturbed. I'm trying to put things right." The guardian's head tilted slightly, as if considering his words, but the flames in its eye sockets burned brighter with rage. "The balance has been broken," it thundered, its voice shaking the ground beneath David's feet. "The curse that was placed upon this tomb was meant to last for eternity. The dead were bound here, their spirits sealed so they could never return. But your greed has shattered that seal. You defiled what was meant to be left undisturbed. And now the consequences fall upon all who tread this land." The figure's hand rose, and with it, the mist that had begun to settle around the clearing stirred violently, swirling into a vortex of darkness. The cold, ghostly light emanating from the guardian illuminated the mist, casting strange, twisting shadows that seemed to reach out toward David like grasping hands. David's pulse quickened. "I didn't disturb this tomb," he said, his voice firmer now, trying to reason with the guardian. "But I'm here to fix it. Let me help you restore the balance." The skeletal figure's hollow eyes flared, and a deep, resonant laugh echoed from within its ribcage, the sound chilling and devoid of any warmth or mirth. "You speak of restoration, yet you carry the tools of those who would tear it apart. You come armed with charms and amulets, thinking you can control forces far older than your feeble race. You cannot fix what you do not understand, and the spirits here, they do not want peace." The mist grew denser, rising like a wave as it circled the tomb and spiraled upward toward the heavens. The guardian extended his bony hand, and the mist obeyed, curling around its skeletal form like a cloak. David could feel the weight of the guardian's presence pressing down on him, a suffocating force that seemed to drain the warmth from his body, leaving only cold and dread in its wake. "You seek to undo what has been done," the guardian said, its voice a low rumble now, filled with a strange melancholic fury. "But the price must be paid. The villagers disturbed the dead, they defied the ancient laws. For that there is no forgiveness." David felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. He had faced dark entities before, but this guardian was unlike anything he had encountered. It was ancient, tied to the land itself, and bound by a code that stretched back eons. It did not see individuals, only the actions of humanity, as a collective that had transgressed. "You don't understand," David said, his voice tight with urgency. "The villagers didn't know what they were doing. They didn't mean to disturb the tomb. It was an accident." "An accident," the guardian spat, its voice dripping with contempt. "They desecrated a burial ground that was never meant to be found. Their ignorance does not absolve them of their crime." David could feel the energy shifting around him, the mist pressing in closer, the cold growing more intense. He could see the flames in the guardian's eyes flickering, the anger in its voice deepening. Time was running out. If he didn't act soon, the guardian would unleash its wrath not just on him, but on the village as well. With trembling hands, David reached into his bag and pulled out another charm, a small, intricately carved stone imbued with the blessings of a long-dead priest. It had been passed down to him by his mentor, and while it had saved him before, he wasn't sure it would be enough to stop a force as ancient and powerful as the Guardian. He held the charm out, its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. "There's still a chance to end this without more bloodshed," David said, his voice calm but filled with desperation. "Let me atone for the villagers' mistakes. I will perform the rites. I will honor the dead. Just give me the chance for a long moment." The Guardian remained silent, its form hovering in the mist, its skeletal hand still raised. The flames in its eyes flickered, and David hoped that maybe he had gotten through. Maybe, just maybe, the ancient being would relent. But then the Guardian's voice cut through the air like a knife, cold and final. "The dead demand justice, not mercy. The balance must be restored, and for that, you must pay the price." Before David could react, the Guardian thrust its hand forward, and the mist surged toward him, an unstoppable wave of darkness. The cold hit him like a physical blow, knocking him back, his body crashing to the ground. The air was sucked from his lungs as the mist wrapped around him, cold tendrils tightening like a vice, squeezing the life out of him. David gasped, struggling to raise the jade amulet, but the cold was overwhelming, seeping into his bones, numbing his fingers. The guardian loomed over him, its hollow eyes burning with cruel intent. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said, its voice low and menacing. "The dead will have their vengeance with a final, desperate effort." David raised the charm in his hand, muttering a prayer under his breath. The stone glowed brighter, its light pushing back against the darkness, if only for a moment. The mist recoiled slightly, giving him just enough room to breathe. But the guardian was relentless. Its skeletal hand clenched into a fist, and the mist surged forward again, stronger this time, more aggressive. David's vision blurred as the cold closed in, his body growing weaker with every second. This was it. He had tried everything, but the guardian was too powerful. The price had to be paid, and it was clear now that it would be his life. But then, in the deepest pit of his despair, David felt something, a warmth, faint but growing, coming from the jade amulet. The light from the relic flared suddenly, blindingly bright, and for the first time the guardian hesitated. The flames in its eyes dimmed and the mist faltered. David's breath came in ragged gasps as the warmth from the amulet spread through his body, pushing back the cold, the darkness. With the renewed. Part 7. The final showdown. The night had turned into a nightmare, one that clung to David like a second skin, tightening with each breath. The skeletal guardian towered over him, its hollow eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. Every movement it made exuded ancient power, a force that had been festering beneath the earth for centuries, waiting to be unleashed. And now, as the earth itself trembled beneath their feet, David knew that this was no ordinary battle. This was a reckoning. The guardian's voice, like the grinding of ancient stone, echoed through the clearing, shaking the very ground beneath him. "The dead demand justice, and you, intruder, shall be the sacrifice." David's heart raced. His usual methods, charms, incantations, protective wards had proven useless against this ancient force. The guardian was too powerful, too deeply rooted in the curse that bound it to the tomb. He could feel the jade amulet pulsing against his chest, its warmth a faint reminder that there was still hope, but it wasn't enough, not yet. As the guardian loomed closer, its skeletal hand raised to strike, David's mind raced. He had no choice now. This wasn't a battle he could win by force alone. He would have to call upon something deeper, something older than the guardian itself. The jade amulet, the one relic he had left, held the key. It was more than just a talisman, it was a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead, capable of channeling energies far beyond what he had ever dared to tap into. But using it meant risking everything. If he failed, the guardian would tear him apart, and the village everyone would be lost. There was no time to think, no time to doubt. David raised the amulet high, gripping it tightly as he began to chant. His voice was low at first, steady but uncertain, as he recited the ancient words that had been passed down through generations of exorcists. The language felt foreign on his tongue, harsh and guttural, as if the very air around him resisted the power of the spell. But as he continued, the words flowed more easily, gaining strength with each syllable, each breath. The earth trembled beneath him, a deep rumble that resonated through his bones. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of ancient energies, stirring beneath the surface. The jade amulet glowed brighter, its light cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows that danced wildly in the night. The guardian paused, its fiery gaze locked on the amulet. For the first time, David saw hesitation in the creature's movements, as if it recognized the power being summoned. The flames in its hollow eyes flickered, and it let out a low, guttural growl, one filled with fury and fear. "You cannot stop this," the guardian hissed, its voice echoing like a death knell. "The balance has been broken, and the dead will not rest until blood is spilled." David's hand shook, the weight of the amulet growing heavier with each passing second. The power coursing through it was immense, almost unbearable, as if the relic itself was straining under the force of the spell. But he couldn't stop, not now. The earth beneath the tomb began to crack, thin fissures spreading out like a web, glowing with the same eerie light that emanated from the guardian. Sweat poured down David's face as he continued the incantation, his voice going louder, more forceful. The words now carried with them a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the air, a primal energy that made the very atmosphere hum with tension. The earth trembled violently, the cracks widening as chunks of dirt and stone began to shift. The guardian let out a roar, its skeletal form flickering as it was pulled toward the glowing fissures beneath it. It lashed out, its hand swiping through the air with inhuman speed, aiming to crush David where he stood. But the jade amulet flared with a brilliant light, and the guardian's hand recoiled, its form destabilizing, flickering like a dying flame. "The price has already been paid," David shouted, his voice filled with a power that wasn't entirely his own. "The dead will rest again. The curse ends here." With a final, desperate cry, David channeled every ounce of energy he had into the amulet. The light from the relic exploded outward, engulfing the entire clearing in a blinding flash. The earth shook violently, as if the very foundations of the world were being torn apart. The cracks beneath the tomb widened, glowing brighter and brighter until the light was almost unbearable. The guardian howled in fury, its form contorting as the light from the amulet tore at its very essence. It tried to fight, clawing at the earth, at the air, at anything it could grasp to stop itself from being pulled back into the depths of the tomb. But it was no use. The power of the spell was too strong, too ancient, and the guardian was bound by the very curse it sought to protect. "You will not survive this," the guardian growled, its voice warped and distorted, as though it was being torn apart by the energy surrounding it. "This is not the end." David's legs buckled beneath him, his strength nearly gone. The amulet in his hand felt like it was burning, searing his skin as the power within it surged to its peak. But he held on, his grip tightening as the final words of the incantation left his lips. The ground beneath the guardian gave way, collapsing in on itself as the light from the amulet swallowed it whole. The skeletal figure let out one last, earth-shaking roar before it was pulled down into the tomb, its body disintegrating into nothingness as the fissure sealed shut behind it. The tremor ceased. The earth stilled. And then silence. David collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. The jade amulet, now demon cool, slipped from his fingers and landed softly in the dirt beside him. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, the stillness of the night wrapping around him like a shroud. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his limbs aching from the strain of the spell. But it was over. The guardian was gone, sealed back within the tomb where it belonged. The curse had been lifted. Slowly, painfully, David pushed himself to his feet. The clearing around him was silent and still, the oppressive energy that had once filled the air now gone. The mist had dissipated, leaving only the faint glow of the moonlight to illuminate the tomb. David stared at the sealed entrance, his mind still reeling from the battle. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. The guardian's final words echoed in his mind. This is not the end. Was it a threat? A warning? David wasn't sure. But he knew that whatever dark power had been sealed within that tomb, it wasn't gone for good. The ancient forces at play here were far beyond anything he had encountered before. And though the village would be safe for now, he couldn't shake the feeling that the balance was still fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. He picked up the jade amulet, its once brilliant glow, now nothing more than a faint flicker, and placed it back around his neck. It had saved him tonight, but it had also taken something from him. The power he had channeled had come at a cost, one he wasn't sure he was willing to pay again. As he turned to leave the clearing, the wind began to stir once more, rustling the branches of the trees around him. The forest, though still dark and foreboding, no longer felt hostile. The spirits, for now, had been laid to rest. But as David walked away from the tomb, leaving the ancient burial ground behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The guardian had been bound, the curse lifted, but the forces of darkness were patient. They would wait, as they always did, for another chance to rise. And next time, David knew he would have to be ready. Part 8. The curse lifted. The night was still, eerily calm after the chaos that had just unfolded. The battle had been fierce, and the power of the ancient guardian had tested David to his very limits. Now, as he stood at the center of the clearing, breathless and battered, the earth beneath his feet finally seemed to rest. The air felt lighter, no longer heavy with the oppressive force that had clung to the village for so long. But the victory felt hollow. David knew better than to trust this newfound calm. The skeletal guardian was gone, its cursed form dragged back into the tomb by the very force it had once controlled. The fissures in the earth had sealed themselves, closing with a finality that seemed almost too neat, too simple. The glowing mist that had curled ominously through the air now dissipated, retreating back into the shadows of the forest. It was as though the land itself was exhaling a long-held breath, relieved to finally be rid of the malevolent presence that had plagued it for centuries. David could feel the change in the atmosphere, the shift in the balance of energy. The spirits that had once tormented the village had begun to withdraw, their whispers growing fainter, their presence fading as the curse unraveled. The oppressive weight that had hung over the village like a shroud was lifting. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the night was silent. But David remained still, his senses still heightened, his instincts screaming at him that it wasn't over. Not yet. He glanced around the clearing, his eyes scanning the edges of the darkened forest. The shadows seemed deeper now, more natural, but they still held a strange sense of unease. The village may have been saved, the spirits pushed back, but the darkness that had been awakened here could not be so easily contained. It was old, far older than the guardian, older than the tomb itself. And it wasn't gone. David could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, like a predator watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike again. He knelt down, pressing his hand to the ground where the guardian had once stood. The earth was cool, the ground solid, but there was something beneath it, something hidden, dormant but still very much alive. The power of the curse had been weakened, but its roots were deep, woven into the very fabric of the land itself. David's heart raced as the realization set in this wasn't over. The curse had been lifted, yes, but not destroyed. The guardian had been a powerful force, but it had only been a gatekeeper, a sentry for something far darker that still lurked in the shadows. Something far more dangerous. He stood slowly, his hand tightening around the jade amulet that still hung from his neck. Its glow had faded to a dull, muted light, its power drained from the battle. But even in its weakened state, the amulet was still warm, still pulsing with a faint energy that told David one thing: there were forces here far beyond his control, forces that had only just begun to stir. The village may have been spared, but for how long? David's gaze drifted toward the distant lights of the village, faintly visible through the trees. He could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the villagers, the joy that would undoubtedly spread through the streets as they realized the nightmare had ended. They would celebrate, believe that the worst had passed, that their lives could return to normal. But David couldn't share their optimism. He had seen too much, felt too much. The darkness that had settled over this place was ancient, patient, and it would not simply fade away because one battle had been won. It would bide its time, waiting for the right moment to rise again, stronger and more determined than before. He sighed, his body aching from the fight, his mind heavy with the weight of what he knew was still to come. The guardian's final words echoed in his mind, haunting him like a ghost. This is not the end. David turned his back on the clearing, walking slowly toward the village. His footsteps were heavy, each one sending a dull thud through the quiet forest. The air, while lighter, still carried a hint of something wrong, something unsettled. The shadows clung to the edges of his vision, as if unwilling to let him forget what had just transpired. As he neared the village, the familiar sounds of life reached his ears: the low murmur of voices, the crackle of fires, and the occasional bark of a dog. It seemed the villagers were already beginning to emerge from their homes, tentatively testing the air, waiting to see if the curse had truly lifted. David could imagine the looks of relief on their faces, the cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, their torment was over. But as he stepped into the edge of the village, David's eyes were drawn to the sky. The moon hung low, casting a pale, ghostly light over the rooftops, but there was something off about it. A faint ring of shadow encircled the moon, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to David's trained eyes. It was a warning. The villagers might not see it, they wouldn't understand, but David knew what it meant. The darkness hadn't left. It was watching, waiting, and it would return. David, a voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Lenny, the villager who had first summoned him, hurrying toward him with a look of gratitude and exhaustion on his face. "You did it. You really did it. The spirits are gone. The village is safe." David forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded, his gaze drifting back toward the horizon. "For now," he said quietly, Lenny frowned, his expression faltering. What do you mean? The curse is broken, isn't it? David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The guardian is gone, he said slowly, and the spirits have retreated. But curses like this, they are not easily undone. The land was disturbed, and something dark was awakened. It may take time, but it will return. You need to be prepared. Lenny's face paled, the weight of David's words settling heavily on his shoulders. What do we do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David looked at the villagers beginning to gather, their faces hopeful but uncertain. He could feel their collective fear, the memories of the terror that had plagued them still fresh in their minds. They had been through so much already, he couldn't bring himself to burden them with the full truth. Not yet. Live your lives, David said, his voice firm but kind. But be vigilant. The darkness may return, but it doesn't have to consume you. You can fight it. You've already shown that. Lenny nodded slowly, though the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. David nodded in return but said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. He had done what he could for now. As the villagers began to disperse, returning to their homes with cautious optimism, David lingered at the edge of the village, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The air was cool, the night quiet, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that still pulsed beneath the surface. The guardian had been defeated, the spirits had retreated, but the curse, the true curse, remained. It was woven into the land, into the very bones of the earth itself, and it would take more than a single battle to unravel it completely. David glanced down at the jade amulet resting against his chest. Its glow had faded, but the warmth remained. It had served him well tonight, but he knew it would need time to recover, just as he would. The next time the darkness rose, he would be ready. But for now, all he could do was wait. As he turned to leave, the faintest whisper of wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it a chill that brushed against the back of his neck. David paused, his heart skipping a beat as he felt the presence distant, but unmistakable. It was still there, watching, waiting. This was not the end, it was only the beginning. Part 9. A lingering thread. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an airy glow over the village, its pale light filtering through the trees like the watchful eye of some distant, indifferent god. David stood at the edge of the village, the warmth of the night doing little to calm the unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The battle had been won, or so it seemed. The guardian had been defeated, the tomb sealed once more, and the vengeful spirits had retreated into the shadows. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight that had gripped the village was gone. But beneath it all, something darker still lingered. David could feel it. There was a stillness now, an unnatural quiet that should have been comforting after the chaos. Yet, instead of relief, it left a hollow pit in his stomach, like the silence before a storm. He had been in too many places, fought too many battles, to believe that this was truly over. The guardian had been powerful, but it was not the source. No, it was merely the gatekeeper, a sentinel for something far older and far more dangerous. His fingers absently traced the jade amulet around his neck, now cool against his skin. The once brilliant glow that had saved him from the guardian's wrath had faded, leaving only a faint, dull shimmer. It had been drained in the fight, and much like himself, it needed time to recover. But time was a luxury they might not have. David knew the tomb had been sealed, but he also knew that seals could be broken, especially by forces as ancient as the ones that resided beneath this cursed land. The villagers believed the worst had passed. They were beginning to come out of their homes, cautiously testing the air, as if afraid that the spirits might still be lurking in the corners of the night. David could see them from where he stood, their faces etchy with exhaustion but carrying the faintest flicker of hope. They had suffered for so long, months, perhaps even years of torment, and now, for the first time, they could breathe. But it was a fragile peace, a peace David knew would not last. He watched as a small group of villagers gathered near the village square, their low murmurs barely audible from his distance. The old woman who had lost her son, the farmer whose livestock had been slaughtered by unseen hands, and the children, so many children, their eyes wide with fear that had aged them beyond their years. They believed the nightmare was over, that the village was finally free from the curse that had plagued them. But David knew better. He turned away, his eyes drifting back toward the darkened forest, toward the tomb hidden deep within. The battle had been fierce. and for a moment he had thought the guardian would tear him apart, drag him down into the depths of the earth where the spirits roam free. But even as the guardian had been pulled back into the earth, its final words echoed in David's mind, "This is not the end." A chill ran down his spine. He could still feel the presence of something out there, something that had been watching, waiting. The guardian had been a test, but the true threat, the source of the curse, remained hidden, buried beneath layers of ancient power that had yet to reveal themselves. And David knew that whatever it wasn't done with him. Not yet. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. The village was quiet now, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. But there was something else, something deeper, almost imperceptible, like the distant hum of a forgotten melody. It was a feeling, a presence that lurked just beyond the edges of perception. David had felt it before, in other places, in other battles. It was the mark of something waiting to rise, something that had not yet been fully defeated. He closed his eyes, reaching out with his senses, trying to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. The earth beneath him felt solid, the air around him calm. But beneath that calmness, there was a pulse of faint, rhythmic beat that seemed to vibrate through the ground, growing stronger with each passing moment. It was the land itself, still stirring with the remnants of the curse, still pulsing with the ancient magic that had been awakened when the tomb was disturbed. David opened his eyes, his gaze narrowing as he focused on the distant horizon. The battle may have ended, but the war was far from over. He had fought many dark forces in his time, but this one was different. This one felt older, more insidious, as if it had been waiting for centuries for the chance to break free. The guardian had been defeated, but it had not been the source. There was something else out there, something far more dangerous, lurking just beneath the surface. David's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The spirits that had attacked the village were vengeful, angry at being disturbed from their eternal rest. But they weren't acting alone. There was a guiding force behind them, a force that had set the events in motion, a force that had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with the tomb sealed and the guardian defeated, that force was regrouping, gathering strength for its next move. He didn't know how long they had, days, weeks, perhaps even months, but eventually it would return. The village was safe for now, but only for now. David sighed, his hand still resting on the jade amulet. It had been his lifeline in the battle, a conduit for the ancient magic that had saved him from the guardian's wrath. But it wasn't enough, not for what was coming. He needed more time, more preparation, more knowledge. He needed to understand the full scope of the curse, the true nature of the spirits that had been awakened. And for that he would have to dig deeper, uncover the secrets that had been buried for centuries. The villagers wouldn't understand. To them, the nightmare was over. They would go back to their lives, rebuild what had been lost, and try to forget the horrors they had witnessed. But David couldn't forget. He couldn't walk away, not yet. As he turned to head back toward the village, his eyes caught sight of something, a flicker of movement in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees. It was quick, barely there, but enough to set his heart racing. He stopped, squinting into the darkness, his senses on high alert. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in unnatural patterns, as if something was lurking just out of sight, watching him. David's breath hitched in his throat. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the amulet. The shadows parted slightly, revealing a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, its form barely visible in the faint moonlight. But David could feel its gaze, cold and unfeeling, locked on him. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. David's pulse quickened. He knew that figure, or rather, he knew what it represented. It was a warning, a reminder that the forces he had fought were still out there, still watching, still waiting for their moment to strike again. He swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the jade amulet. The air around him felt colder now, the sense of unease growing stronger. The village may have been spared, but the darkness had not left. It was still here, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. David forced himself to turn away, his steps slow and deliberate as he made his way back toward the village. He couldn't let them see his fear, couldn't let them know that the threat hadn't truly passed. They needed hope, needed to believe that the worst was over. But David knew the truth. The guardian had been defeated. but the ancient curse that had gripped this land was far from broken. The figure at the edge of the forest remained, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. David could feel its gaze on him as he walked, the weight of its presence pressing down on him like a cold, invisible hand. As he reached the edge of the village, David glanced back one last time. The figure was gone, but the sense of unease remained. He knew it would return. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. David took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He couldn't stay here forever, couldn't protect the village from the darkness that was gathering. But he could prepare, he could learn. And when the time came, he would be ready. For now, the village was safe. But David knew that the peace wouldn't last. It never did.